The age of Augustus is considered by many to be the beginning of the Roman Empire, and if that's true, then this would make him one of the most important people in all of human history. But if we want to tell his story properly, we need to start at the beginning. So let's take a look at Chapter 1, Setting the Stage. The world before Augustus. The late Roman Republic was a time of crisis. For several generations, Rome had been mired in civil wars and political instability. While it was true that previous generations of Romans had also known their fair share of conflict, this was different. It was as if the entire Roman political system had broken down and degenerated into a cycle of violence and vengeance. This all culminated with the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, an event which shocked the entire Mediterranean world. After centuries of republican government, was Rome now destined to fall under the rule of kings once again? Or perhaps even worse, a military dictatorship like the ones they had seen in neighboring Gaul? But before we dive into the era of Augustus, we're going to set the stage by taking a closer look at the world of the late Roman Republic. So if you're ready to join me on this journey back in time, then come with me now as we travel back to ancient Rome. Now it would be an exaggeration to say that the Roman Republic was in its death throes by 60 BC. While it was certainly true that the old ways of doing things were rapidly disappearing, there was nothing inevitable about this. In fact, some historians argue that the late Republic was simply a necessary growing pain in Rome's development. By this point, Rome had become a Mediterranean superpower. Its armies dominated the western half of the region, while its influence spread far beyond its borders. Despite this, Rome was still technically a small collection of Italian city-states, rather than a real empire. What was needed was a strong leader who could centralize power and impose order on Rome's unruly provinces. Some historians argue that Augustus was this man and that the entire transformation from republic to empire was simply the process of Augustus consolidating power and bringing stability to Rome. Others, however, argue that the problems of the late republic were more complex than can be explained by such a simplistic narrative. They point to the deep social and economic tensions that were tearing Rome apart as evidence that the republic was doomed, no matter who was in power. However, whatever the truth may be, there is no denying that the decades leading up to Augustus's reign were a time of great turmoil and violence. This began in earnest with the Social War, a conflict between Rome and its Italian allies over the issue of Roman citizenship. This war lasted from 91 to 88 BC and resulted in the defeat of Rome's allies and the extension of citizenship to all Italians. However, this was only a temporary solution to Rome's problems. The following decades were marked by a series of civil wars as various Roman generals carved out spheres of influence across the Mediterranean. The First Mithridatic War saw the Roman general Sulla clash with the king of Pontus in the east. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Populares and Optimate factions were constantly at each other's throats. Eventually, the First Triumvirate emerged as a way to end this power struggle, comprised of the generals Pompey and Crassus, along with the politician Caesar. This alliance dominated Roman politics in the final years of the Republic. However, after Crassus's death in 53 BC, the First Triumvirate fell apart, and the Second Triumvirate soon formed between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus's widow Calpurnia. By 60 BC, the entire political situation in Rome had become increasingly unstable. While the First Triumvirate had brought a brief period of calm, it had also created a dangerous precedent. The notion that a few powerful individuals could simply ignore the traditional power structures of the Republic and impose their own rule was deeply unsettling to many Romans. As historian Ronald Syme put it, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were not content to be colleagues and friends. Each of them wanted to be the first. A settlement based on sharing was a makeshift and precarious expedient, but it did not work. As we discussed in our last video, by 58 BC, Caesar had been appointed governor of Gaul, a position which allowed him to raise an independent army and build his own power base. 2 years later, he returned to Italy in triumph, after defeating the Gauls and securing vast territories for Rome. His return, however, caused political problems, as he had amassed a large army which threatened the delicate balance of power in Rome. Pompey, on the other hand, was eager to maintain the status quo. He was married to the daughter of the current dictator, had close ties to the conservative Optimates, and had spent the last decade trying to stabilize the eastern provinces. With Caesar threatening to upset this balance, it was clear that war was on the horizon. And so it was that in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army and marched on Rome. This act of defiance was met with outrage by the Roman Senate, which declared Caesar a public enemy and gave Pompey the authority to raise an army to crush him. The ensuing civil war was swift and decisive. Caesar's army was superior to Pompey's, and he was able to easily defeat his opponents in battle. By 47 BC, Caesar had full control of Italy and was effectively the master of Rome. However, his problems were far from over. There were still pockets of resistance to his rule across the Mediterranean, and he would have to spend the next few years putting down rebellions and securing his position. Despite this, upon returning to Rome in 46 BC, Caesar wasted no time in consolidating his power. He began by instituting a series of reforms designed to make him popular with the Roman people. He established a number of public works projects, including new roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. He also enacted a series of social reforms, such as the establishment of colonies for poor citizens and the introduction of grain subsidies. These policies were well received by the majority of Romans, but they were deeply unpopular with the elites. The wealthy landowners who had always dominated Roman politics were furious at Caesar's attempts to redistribute power and wealth. They saw him as a threat to the traditional values of the Republic, and they would stop at nothing to get rid of him. This tension between Caesar and the elites came to a head in 44 BC, when a group of senators assassinated him. This event sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, and it seemed for a moment as if the Republic might be saved. However, as we will see in our next video, the assassination of Caesar would ultimately lead to the rise of Augustus and the end of the Republic once and for all. So I hope you can see why the world of the late Republic was so important for understanding the rise of Augustus. The civil wars and political instability of this period created the conditions which allowed Augustus to come to power, and it was only after he took control of Rome that the empire as we know it began to take shape. So if you want to learn more about this critical time in ancient history, then I highly recommend checking out these two resources. In our next video, we're going to discuss the aftermath of Caesar's assassination and how it led to Augustus's rise to power. So make sure to stay tuned if you want to see that. If you enjoyed this video, then please be sure to like and subscribe. You can also check out my podcast, Ancient History News, where I discuss all sorts of topics related to the ancient world. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. The month of September in the year of 63 BCE was an eventful one. In Athens, a general named Pompey the Great had just defeated the forces of the Roman Republic's enemies in Asia Minor. Back in Rome, a Roman senator named Gaius was preparing for an extended stay in the provinces, and a few miles outside of the city in the suburb of Subura, Gaius Octavius was born. In this series, we explore the lives of the Caesars. This is Chapter 2, The Birth of Gaius Octavius. As we explained in our first episode, Gaius Octavius was related to Julius Caesar through his great-grandfather, Gaius Julius Caesar, but when he was born, he was simply Gaius Octavius, not even bearing the name Julius, a distinction reserved for males only. His father, also named Gaius, was a member of the Roman equites, or the class below the Senate. Yet he was still connected to the Roman nobility. He was the nephew of Lucius Aelius Tubero, a consul from 149. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, hailed from a distinguished family with her grandfather having been consul in 146. So while they were not rich or noble, the Octavian family was far from poor or obscure. Their home was in the Subura district of Rome, an area known for its humbler folk, but also for its ambitions. It was where the she-wolf suckled Romulus and Remus, according to legend, and it was where Mark Antony was raised. By all accounts, young Gaius grew up in a quiet household. Suetonius described them as a modest and unpretentious family. In Greek, Polybius wrote that his father and grandfather were men of good family, but not over-rich, even though he didn't live in luxury. Cassius Dio tells us that Octavian was considered to be well brought up and of superior intelligence. When he was 2, his father died and was deified, becoming the god of August. 2 years later, his mother married Gaius, a man who would become one of the conspirators against Caesar. Although the young Octavian had no say in the matter, he would forever be tied to the plot by virtue of being the stepson of one of its members. We don't know if he ever knew his stepfather, as he was only around 6 years old when Caesar was assassinated. It's important to note that we have almost no direct sources for Octavian's early life. Everything we know comes from later writers whose memories of him were colored by his deeds as Augustus, emperor and founder of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They were writing decades after the fact and therefore prone to embellishment or omission. As such, it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction. What we do know comes from three primary sources. The first is Plutarch's Life of Augustus, which serves as a biography of both Octavian and his adopted father, Caesar. Second is Cassius Dio's Roman History, an epic narrative of Rome's past from its mythical origins to the reign of Emperor Hadrian. And finally, there are scattered mentions of Octavian in letters by Cicero and Suetonius's De Vita Caesarum, often referred to as the 12 Caesars, a collection of biographies of Rome's first emperors. Cicero first met Octavian in Athens during his own exile in 58. He describes meeting a boy of about 15, staying with him for a few days, and engaging him in conversation about philosophy. In his letter to Atticus, he writes that Octavian was a serious lad, though somewhat too fond of talking. He adds that he believed the boy had a bright future ahead of him, and said that he was already capable of managing affairs of state. In another letter, Cicero observes that Octavian was a child of such a serious and thoughtful disposition that if anything of his father's proved to be hereditary, he will be superior to his guardian in the management of public business. While in Athens, Cicero also engaged Octavian's tutor in philosophical debate and was apparently satisfied with what he found. If you're enjoying this episode, please subscribe to stay up to date on future installments. Our third source is Plutarch, who describes Octavian as of slow and deliberate speech and careful to consider each word before he uttered it. He was a man of infinite patience. Patience is indeed an important trait for anyone, let alone someone who would go on to rule Rome for decades. These descriptions, along with others by Dio and Suetonius, paint a picture of a quiet but intelligent and pensive boy. In contrast to his adoptive father, Caesar, we see a youth who doesn't rush his words and who thinks before he speaks. According to tradition, young Octavian was sent to Athens to study rhetoric under the philosopher and statesman Hortensius Hortalus. During his time in Greece, he visited the sanctuaries of the gods and followed the customs of the country. He was educated in the classics, studied philosophy, and honed his skills as an orator. In Athens, he also participated in theatrical competitions, where his skill as an actor caught the attention of Roman Senator Hortensius, who reportedly said he had never seen the boy's equal. Though Suetonius asserts that he returned to Rome without finishing his education, Plutarch says he completed his studies and was ready to practice law. As the son of Caesar's sister, Octavian was his heir, at least according to Caesar himself, but his claim was disputed by many, including the other heirs and Caesar's assassins. Nonetheless, shortly before his assassination, Caesar formally adopted Octavian, giving him the name Gaius Caesar and legally establishing him as his heir. In accordance with Roman custom, Caesar had a statue of himself made to be placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a temple dedicated to the goddess, who, according to tradition, was the great-grandmother of the divine Aeneas, the mythical founder of Rome. According to Plutarch, the statue showed Caesar in the guise of the god Oceanus, wearing a crown and holding a scepter. To solidify their relationship, Caesar ordered that a bronze image of himself be set beside the altar in his private shrine at the entrance to his house. Here, Plutarch tells us, young Octavian would burn incense every day and make offerings. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BCE at the time. Octavian was in Rome, but he was away on military campaign. As soon as he heard the news, he left his troops and hurried back to the capital. On his way, he was met by Agrippa and others, who informed him that Sextus Pompey was gathering support in the Senate. They advised him to raise troops and lay siege to Pompey's strongholds. Instead, Octavian decided to return to Athens to rally Caesar's former allies. According to Cassius Dio, he told the people of Athens that he wanted to wait until he could assemble a force large enough to deal with Pompey decisively. Once in the Balkans, he secured supplies and reinforcements and began his march on Rome. When Octavian returned to Italy, he was virtually unknown to the people of Rome, even though he was only 19 years old and had just inherited Caesar's mantle. According to Plutarch, his appearance wasn't striking. He was short and slight of build and didn't project confidence or power. Nevertheless, he began making the rounds, visiting influential senators and reminding them of Caesar's accomplishments. In doing so, he cultivated goodwill and support among the elite, which was vital to his rise to power. And that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to stay up to date on future installments. You can listen to this episode and more on our podcast, available on various platforms. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Alright, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, welcome. If you're returning, thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you keep coming back. Today we are going to continue with the series on the Octavians. So if you haven't watched episode 1, you might want to go and check it out first, because this episode will contain spoilers for that one. Also, please remember to like this video, subscribe and turn notifications on so you never miss an upload. And let's get into today's episode. We are now at the point in Roman history where there is no emperor, and there should be. There is a power vacuum, and Rome needs an heir to Caesar. Now, when Caesar died, he had just celebrated his 55th birthday, and he was at the height of his power. He had defeated Pompey, and he had begun reforming the Roman calendar. He was very much alive in the public eye. So when he was assassinated by a group of senators on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, this caused quite the stir. However, while it may have been shocking to the common folk, those who were close to Caesar knew exactly what was coming, because about 2 years prior to this, Caesar had made it very clear that he wanted Octavian, his grandnephew, to become his heir. But this didn't mean that everyone would happily step aside and allow for this to happen. No, not by a long shot. See, Rome wasn't ready for an emperor. They were used to having consuls and other magistrates serve one-year terms, so the idea that someone could just hold on to power indefinitely just wasn't acceptable to the Romans. Caesar had practically shown them that he wanted to be a king, but they weren't having it. The irony, of course, being that Caesar wasn't even allowed to officially become a king. Not that he really wanted to anyway. So when Caesar was killed, Rome was thrown into turmoil. The assassins believed that they were doing the right thing, saving Rome from tyranny, but they hadn't counted on just how popular Caesar actually was. The common folk were furious, and they took to the streets to protest. Even some senators regretted their decision to kill Caesar, but there was nothing that could be done now. Caesar was dead, and there was no turning back, but all hope was not lost. See, as Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian was next in line. He was the closest relative that Caesar had. However, the problem was that Octavian was only 19 years old at the time of Caesar's death, and he was in the Greek province of Asia Minor, not Rome. So how was he supposed to get back to Rome and claim his inheritance? Well, it was actually Mark Antony who helped him do it. You see, Mark Antony was one of the leading figures in Rome at the time, and he owed his career to Caesar. In fact, Mark Antony was married to Caesar's daughter, Julia, so when Caesar was killed, Mark Antony was furious. He blamed the senators for killing Caesar, and he wanted revenge. But Mark Antony also realized that he couldn't just go to war with the senators. He needed help. So he sent a letter to Octavian, begging him to come to Rome and save Rome. Of course, Octavian was only 19 years old, and he was afraid to come to Rome. He knew that if he did, he would be assassinated just like Caesar. But Octavian was also brave. He knew that he was Caesar's heir, and he knew that he had to do what was right. So despite his fear, Octavian got on a ship and sailed to Rome. When Octavian arrived in Rome, he was greeted as a hero. The people of Rome loved Caesar, and they loved Caesar's heir. They cheered as Octavian rode through the streets in his chariot. They threw flowers at his feet, and they shouted, "Long live the emperor!" And then Octavian went to see Mark Antony, and they formed an alliance. Mark Antony gave Octavian half of his power and half of his legions, and together they marched on Rome. The senators had thought that they could get away with killing Caesar, but they were wrong. Octavian and Mark Antony took control of Rome, and the senators fled. But even though Octavian was now in control of Rome, he wasn't safe yet. There were still people who wanted him dead, including Brutus and Cassius, the two men who had stabbed Caesar to death. Brutus and Cassius fled to Greece, and they raised an army to take on Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian was scared, but he knew that he had to fight. He and Mark Antony met the assassins' army at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. And although it was a hard-fought battle, Octavian and Mark Antony came out on top. Brutus and Cassius both died in the battle, and Octavian was finally safe. He had proven that he could fight, and he had proven that he was worthy of being Caesar's heir. After the battle, Octavian and Mark Antony returned to Rome as heroes. They were greeted with parades and feasts, and everyone in Rome loved them. And then something else happened that made Octavian very popular. See, when Caesar was killed, he left a will, and in that will, he stated that he wanted Octavian to inherit his money and his property. Now, most rich Romans did this. It was common practice for wealthy people to leave money and property to their heirs in their wills. But what made Caesar's will different was the amount of money and property that he left to Octavian. You see, Caesar was the richest man in Rome. He had acquired a fortune through his conquests and through his political career, and he left all of that money and property to Octavian. Overnight, Octavian went from being a poor young man to being the richest man in Rome. He inherited Caesar's villas and his palaces. He inherited Caesar's gold and silver. He even inherited Caesar's slaves. And you can bet that the slaves were eager to serve Octavian. They had loved Caesar, and they knew that Octavian was Caesar's heir, so they were happy to transfer their loyalty from Caesar to Octavian. So within just a few months of Caesar's death, Octavian had gone from being a nobody to being the most powerful young man in Rome. He was the richest man in Rome. He was the most popular man in Rome, and he was the most eligible bachelor in Rome. Basically, Octavian had it all. But that didn't mean that he was satisfied. Oh no, you see, Octavian was ambitious. He wanted more than just to be the richest man in Rome. He wanted to be the most powerful man in Rome. In fact, Octavian had already started making plans to take over the whole Roman world. He was tired of being just another senator. He wanted to be more than just another senator. He wanted to be emperor. So in 27 BCE, Octavian declared himself Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. From that day forward, Augustus ruled over Rome with an iron fist. He kept order. He built roads and aqueducts and temples. He patronized art and literature. Basically, Augustus did everything he could to make Rome great. And he ruled over Rome for 40 years until he died in 14 CE. So yeah, Augustus was definitely successful. But without Caesar, none of this would have been possible. Augustus owed his entire reign to Caesar. In fact, when Augustus died, he left his reign to his adopted father's grandnephew, Tiberius. So yeah, thanks, Caesar. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn notifications on so you never miss an upload. And I'll see you next time. Bye. Chapter 4, The Young Triumvirate. The year is 43 BC and Rome is in chaos. Caesar is dead and his adopted son Octavian is seeking to avenge him, but he needs allies. Luckily for him, two of Caesar's former allies are willing to join his cause, Mark Antony and Lepidus. Together, they will form the Second Triumvirate and rule Rome between them. What follows is a tale of vengeance, power grabs, and political assassinations. Let's get into it. After Caesar's funeral, Octavian left for Apollonia in Greece to take command of the legions Caesar had left behind. He would have preferred to stay in Rome and take charge there, but his mother, Attia, persuaded him otherwise. She didn't want him anywhere near Rome when all these dangerous power struggles were taking place. Octavian was only 20 years old at this point, the youngest of the three triumvirs, hence our chapter title, The Young Triumvirate. Still, he had proven himself capable in politics and on the battlefield. While in Apollonia, he raised a fleet to control the seas around the Italian peninsula and set about making preparations for war against Caesar's assassins. In Rome, Lepidus and Mark Antony made similar preparations. Both men were older and more experienced than Octavian, but their cooperation was vital if they were going to stand against the assassins. Despite their alliance though, each one wanted more power for himself. To make sure no one got too powerful, the agreement was that none of them would set foot in Rome while the others were there. Rome, after all, was the seat of the empire, and whoever controlled Rome wielded immense power. In effect, this kept them from fighting each other as they marched on their enemies in the east. But who exactly were these enemies? Well, before we go any further, let me tell you about today's sponsor. Caesar's assassins had fled to Greece, where they hoped to rally support and raise armies. Among them were some of Rome's most famous figures, such as Brutus and Cassius. It was Cassius who urged Caesar to cross the Rubicon, so that he could conquer the Roman world, and it was Brutus who dealt the fatal blow. These men believed they had saved Rome by killing Caesar, but the people of Rome disagreed. Caesar was a war hero and a benevolent dictator. Sure, he was ambitious, but he also built roads and aqueducts, reformed the calendar, and rescued the Roman Republic. They hated the assassins for killing Caesar, and now that Octavian was leading an army to punish them, the assassins needed new allies. That's why they went to the city of Philippi. There they met up with forces loyal to the kings of Pontus and Pergamum, who were threatened by Caesar's growing power. Octavian's response to this alliance was proscriptions. A proscription was basically a list of names. Those whose names were on the list were declared outlaws. Their property was confiscated, and their lives were forfeit. It was a convenient way to get rid of your enemies, and Octavian put many of Caesar's enemies on these lists. These proscriptions also helped fund Octavian's war, since anyone who turned in the heads of those on the list received a bounty. Even worse, many Romans were put on these lists simply for being related to the assassins. For example, Cicero was put on the list because his brother was married to one of Cassius's sisters. This proscription helped paint Octavian as Caesar's avenger, but it also made him extremely unpopular. He didn't care about popularity though. He wanted power, and power is what he would get. He landed in Brundisium in 42 BC with a fleet of 200 ships and 80,000 soldiers, while Lepidus arrived with another fleet and 40,000 soldiers. Soon, all of Italy was under their control, and all that stood between Octavian and total control of the Roman world were Brutus and Cassius. At this point, Octavian handed over command to Agrippa, his right-hand man, and returned to Rome. He needed to fix all the problems he had created there. Apparently, his prescriptions weren't enough, because as he returned to Rome, he had to flee for his life. His assassins had been waiting for him. When they learned he was returning, they ambushed his ship with cavalry and forced it to turn back. Then they sent a runner ahead to attack him on the road. They even tried to assassinate him in the Senate, but he narrowly escaped all of these attempts on his life. Eventually, they grew tired of trying. By now, Octavian had fortified his villas in the countryside and gathered loyal troops around him. Not wanting to be caught like rats in a trap, the assassins fled Rome. Octavian pursued them and soon found himself in the province of Cisalpine, Gaul. Here he resupplied and reorganized his troops and prepared for the final confrontation with the assassins. Meanwhile, across the Adriatic Sea, Mark Antony and Lepidus were having issues of their own. When Lepidus approached Antony, he tried to steal all of Caesar's eastern provinces for himself. Antony retaliated by placing his own men in key positions around the city and then summoned Lepidus to the Senate House to discuss the division of the eastern provinces. There he had Lepidus arrested and sent back to Rome under guard. With Lepidus out of the picture, Mark Antony became sole master of the eastern Mediterranean. Around this time, news arrived in Rome that Brutus and Cassius had taken control of Greece and were marching on the city of Philippi. This meant the assassins were getting closer to Rome, and so Octavian needed to get to Rome as quickly as he could. But how could he get there safely? Well, luckily for him, his assassins had given him the perfect opportunity. When they had attacked his ship, they had stolen his baggage, and among the things they stole were several sets of armor and weapons. One of these sets belonged to a general named Titus Labienus. The assassins thought it was just some common soldier's armor, but it happened to fit Octavian perfectly. So perfectly, in fact, that when Octavian showed up to the Senate House wearing that armor, people assumed he was a god. This moment was captured by the famous Roman painter and sculptor, the Roman copy of Greek sculptor Lysippus's work, which shows Octavian as a young man, wearing that very armor, holding a spear and a shield. It's safe to say this armor made him pretty popular in Rome. Anyway, with his popularity boosted, he appointed a governor to replace Lepidus, called back his navy from Italy, and then set sail for Greece. Meanwhile, Mark Antony finished subduing the eastern provinces and then sailed to meet up with Octavian. When they met up, they divided the eastern provinces between them. Then, together they marched on Philippi, where Brutus and Cassius had set up camp. This was the beginning of the end for the assassins. There were two battles of Philippi. The first battle saw the assassins win a minor victory, but the second battle was a total defeat for them. Cassius took his own life, and Brutus was executed on Octavian's orders. Now, technically, Brutus was pardoned before he died, but that pardon didn't do much for him. With the assassins gone, Octavian and Antony divided the entire Roman world between them. Rome was truly theirs. They had defeated Caesar's murderers, and they had crushed all opposition. Only Lepidus remained a problem, but he was safely locked away in his villa near Rome, or so Octavian thought. Because Lepidus had spent the last 2 years gathering loyal troops around him and making plans for a coup. But now wasn't the time for a coup. First, Lepidus had to deal with Cicero. You see, during Octavian's escape from Rome, Cicero had used his influence in the Senate to declare Lepidus a public enemy. If Lepidus was going to seize power in Rome, Cicero had to die. And so when Lepidus's troops seized Cicero, they brought him to the Tullian prison in the Forum Romanum. There they chopped off his head along with the heads of his 2 sons, and threw all 3 bodies down a well. It was a brutal end for a great Roman, but it was necessary. After dealing with Cicero, Lepidus took his troops to the Forum and seized control of the city. He then entered the temple of the goddess of victory and sacrificed a goat to her. Then he celebrated with a feast. All of Rome was his. Lepidus may not have had the military power of Antony or the political influence of Octavian, but he did know how to strike when the iron was hot. Now, only one question remained. What would happen next? Hey there, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of the series. And thank you for watching. Welcome back to the channel. In the last episode, we saw the 3 victorious generals of the Second Triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, march into Rome together to take control of that city. And at in chapter 5, where we see how their uneasy partnership is going to start to fracture and eventually tear itself apart. The division of the Roman world amongst these 3 men would prove to be very convenient for us, as we are going to follow each of them individually, after they divide up their territories. But we'll get to that later because we're not there yet. As always, if you enjoy this content, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment. All those things really help me out, and make sure you stick around to the end, because I have an announcement about the Patreon at the end of this video. So let's get started. First of all, this chapter opens with an interesting little side note. It says that at the same time this story takes place, there is also a civil war going on in Athens between 2 rival political parties. They are called the New Academy and the Old Academy, which must be very confusing to anyone else from another school. These guys sound crazy, but that's neither here nor there, because this civil war is just a backdrop to the main conflict and isn't directly involved with our boys. Back in Rome, the 3 triumvirs are holding a meeting about how they're going to divide up the spoils of war. Lepidus has come down with some ideas about who should get what, but right off the bat, we know that this plan is doomed to fail, because Lepidus doesn't have the power to enforce it. He reminds the others that he was the one who defeated Sextus Pompey and taken the rich province of Sicily for the Roman people, and so he deserves to be rewarded for that. But no one is listening to him. They've got other plans. Octavian wants the western provinces of Spain, Gaul and Britain, while Antony wants the eastern provinces of the Near East, like Anatolia, Greece, and the rest of the Mediterranean islands. For Lepidus, that leaves Africa, which isn't as desirable. Lepidus gets angry and says, "Why do you want everything?" But then he realizes that he's fighting a losing battle here, so he drops it and just settles for the African provinces instead. So far, so good. No problems. Everyone is getting what they want. And then the problem comes up of what to do with Rome, who will be in charge of this city. And it seems like the most logical solution would be to split the responsibilities among them. I mean, there's no way any of them would ever agree to giving up their power over the city, but maybe they could share it. And Lepidus tries to suggest that again, but both Octavian and Antony think that's a stupid idea. Antony tells Lepidus, "Why don't you go ahead and take your new province and stay there? You can govern Africa without having to worry about Rome." Now, this is a pretty shitty thing to say, but it's probably true. Lepidus is old and tired and not really up for dealing with the intrigues of Roman politics, so he does just that. He heads back to his province, and we won't see him for a long time. So now Octavian and Antony are left in charge of the Roman world, and they're going to start vying for more power. This section of the book is going to focus on the differences between these 2 characters, and it's done through a series of anecdotes and stories that highlight their different personalities. First, we meet 2 Roman nobles named Gaius and Lucius Caesar, and they're staying with Octavian at his villa. These 2 were like adopted grandnephews of Julius Caesar. They lived with him and were groomed for political office. We've met them before when Caesar brought them to the Senate to introduce them as future leaders of Rome. Well, they re-staying at the villa, and they re-asking Octavian what kind of a welcome party they should throw to celebrate their return to Rome. And Octavian says, "Screw that, don't do anything. Just stay here quietly until everyone stops talking about the civil war." The two young men are kind of confused by this, but they decide to go along with it anyway. The next day, though, they head into the city and they meet up with Antony, and guess what? Antony throws a huge party in their honor and invites all the leading senators, and afterwards, Antony sends them back to the villa with even more fancy clothes and jewels than they had before. They come running back to Octavian and tell him what happened and ask him, "What the hell? Right, why did you tell us not to celebrate?" And Antony is celebrating. This is where Cassius Dio gives us a bit of insight about their different personalities. He says that Octavian was frugal and careful with money, whereas Antony was lavish and reckless. But that doesn't mean he didn't know what he was doing. Cassius Dio says that Antony knew exactly what he was doing, and his strategy was to win over the Roman people with displays of generosity and grandeur. But while Antony was winning popularity contests, Octavian was making moves to consolidate his power in the West. He starts sending governors to the newly conquered provinces of Hither Spain, Cisalpine Gaul, and Narbonese Gaul, and Britain. He's basically putting loyalists in charge of these provinces to keep them in line. We're also introduced to Agrippa, who is going to play an important role in this story. Agrippa is an ex-slave who was freed by his master and given the name Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. He had fought alongside Caesar and then switched over to Octavian during the Civil War. Now, Octavian sends him to govern the newly acquired province of the southwestern peninsula of Italy, which includes the island of Sicily. Sicily had been held by Sextus Pompey until Lepidus took it, and now Octavian is sending Agrippa there to collect the taxes Sextus Pompey owed the Roman treasury. Meanwhile, in the east, Antony is taking a whole different approach. After securing Greece and the other Mediterranean islands, he headed to Alexandria to meet up with Cleopatra, his mistress. And we're going to spend some time here because Antony's going to wind up spending the entire eastern half of the book in Egypt. When Antony arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra wasn't there. She had heard about his coming and wanted to make a big entrance, so she hid herself in a carpet, rolled up inside a mat, and snuck her way into Antony's ship. When he opened it up to take a look, she was gone and he couldn't find her anywhere. So he sent his brother, who was in charge of guarding the harbor, to find her, and he found her hiding in a pillar. Then she pretended to be surprised to see him, played hard to get a little bit, and then agreed to meet up with him again later. And that's when they fell in love. Now, I feel like I have to point out here that in the original language, the word used here for love is actually pretty vague and could be translated to something like desire or lust. But either way, they hit it off, and they went to spend some time together in Cleopatra's homeland, which is conveniently located just across the Mediterranean Sea. They returned to Alexandria, where Cleopatra showed him around and paraded her magnificent fleet of ships before him. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra claimed that only someone like Antony, who was a great general and conqueror himself, could be worthy of ruling over Egypt and its vast riches. If that's true, then Octavian is definitely not the guy for the job. After all that, Antony decides to return to Athens and hold court there. His first order of business is to settle a lawsuit between Bithynia and Pontus, and he rules in favor of Bithynia. Apparently, the judge who had originally heard the case had been bribed by the other side. So Antony ordered that the judge be put to death, and Bithynia was awarded double the damages. That's how justice works, y'all. Anyway, after all that, Antony heads back to Alexandria to reunite with his favorite queen, and that's where the chapter ends. In the next episode, we'll see how their relationship develops, and what happens when Octavian finds out that his best friend is shacking up with an Egyptian queen. As I mentioned in the intro, we're currently working on our own Roman history podcast. We're covering the Republic and the early Empire. We've already finished the Republic, and now we're moving into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first of the 5 good emperors. It's a lot of fun. We're learning a lot, and I hope you enjoy it too. We publish episodes every Thursday and Friday, and we're posting them early on our website. So that's everything I have for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and join us on our community platform. We'd love to have you there. If you'd like to support us, we have some merch available. It's the best way to support us. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, Take care. Chapter 6. Antony and Cleopatra. When we last saw him, Octavian had just defeated his rival Pompey, and with most of the Roman world under his control, it seemed like he was well on his way to becoming the first emperor of Rome. But Octavian had rivals still left to defeat, and perhaps the greatest of these was not a man, but a woman. Her name was Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and she was in love with a Roman general named Antony. Their relationship threatened Octavian's plans for the future of Rome, and so he launched a propaganda campaign to paint Antony as a traitor who had abandoned the city for the pleasures of the Egyptian court. He claimed that Antony had betrayed Caesar by allying himself with Cleopatra, and that if Rome wasn't careful, her web of enchantment would ensnare the entire empire. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra would push Rome to the brink of another civil war, and when the dust settled, only one of them would be left standing. The year is 32 BC, and the place is Rome. After defeating his enemies in the civil war, Octavian has consolidated his power over the entire Mediterranean. The people of Rome are enjoying a period of peace and prosperity that they have not seen in generations, and Octavian, or Augustus as he now prefers to be called, wants to keep things that way. He has no desire to start a war. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done, because there are several ambitious generals in Rome still looking for their own chance at power. In Egypt, Mark Antony is getting ready to invade Parthia, an ancient kingdom located in what is today Iran. He has been planning this invasion for some time, but he has been delayed by personal problems. You see, Antony is married to a woman named Octavia, the sister of Augustus, but he has grown tired of her, and their marriage is childless. Meanwhile, his relationship with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra grows more serious by the day. She is not only beautiful, according to Roman standards, but also intelligent and witty. Unlike many of the women in Antony's life, Cleopatra is not interested in being just a trophy wife. She is a powerful ruler in her own right, and she knows how to use her feminine wiles to get what she wants. Augustus learns about the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra, and he is furious. It is a scandal, a betrayal. Antony has broken his trust, and worse, he has embarrassed Augustus by choosing a foreign queen over his own sister. Of course, Augustus could have simply ignored the affair, but instead, he launches a propaganda campaign to smear Cleopatra and turn the Roman people against her. He paints her as a dangerous seductress, who has cast a spell over Antony and taken control of his mind. In speeches and pamphlets across the empire, he warns that Cleopatra's influence is growing, and if the Romans don't act soon, she will take over Rome itself. In reality, it is Augustus who has benefited the most from the breakup with Antony. The two of them were once close friends, but after Caesar's assassination, they became rivals. Antony was one of the men who shared Caesar's fortune, and he used his share to build up an army in the east. This made him a threat to Augustus, who was afraid that Antony would challenge him for control of Rome. By smearing Antony's name, Augustus hopes to weaken his rival and make him unpopular, and it seems to be working. The Romans do not like foreigners, and the thought of Cleopatra ruling over Rome is enough to make them suspicious of Antony. Meanwhile, Antony ignores the rumors and focuses on his invasion of Parthia. He needs a strong military victory to boost his prestige and prove that he is still a capable general. His invasion of Parthia is successful, and he returns to Rome a hero. However, his triumph is short-lived, because as soon as he steps foot into the city, he is arrested and accused of treason. His supporters are shocked and outraged, but Antony is powerless to stop it. He is sent to the city of Brundisium, on the southern coast of Italy, where he is put under house arrest. Here, Antony makes the mistake of writing a letter to Cleopatra. In the letter, he complains about his treatment at the hands of Augustus, and swears that he will never give up his love for her. Augustus gets hold of the letter, and uses it as further proof that Antony is a traitor. He releases the letter to the winds and the entire Roman world. Soon every Roman is talking about Antony's betrayal. His reputation is ruined, and at this point Antony could probably try to escape to Egypt and live out the remainder of his life in luxury with Cleopatra. There is nothing Augustus can do to stop him from leaving, but Antony is a proud soldier and he refuses to be humiliated. Instead, he decides to fight back against his rival, but unfortunately, he does not have the support of the Roman people, and his attempt to rally his former supporters fails. He has alienated too many people with his behavior, and there are no longer any allies left for him. On the other hand, Augustus is playing the part of the perfect Roman statesman. He has brought peace and prosperity to the empire, and he is not about to let some foreign queen take it away from him. So while Antony is gathering his forces, Augustus is doing the same. Two armies meet in northern Greece, and the battle is one of the largest and most brutal in ancient history. Antony's forces are defeated, and he is forced to flee with Cleopatra back to Egypt. Now that they are both defeated, it is clear that something must be done to eliminate the threat they pose to Augustus. But before we talk about what happens next, let me tell you about our sponsor, Masterworks. Masterworks is the premier art investment platform. They allow you to invest in multi-million-dollar paintings for a fraction of the cost. Since its launch in 2021, the Masterworks platform has sold 3 paintings with net proceeds going to investors after fees, with the average return being over 30%. Buying shares of a Monet or a Picasso is as easy as buying shares of stock. The process takes just a few minutes. Your investment is securely held in a trust and delivered directly to your doorstep or a loved one in as little as 2 days. There are no commissions, no minimum investment, and no hassle. So how does this work? The way it works is that they buy expensive paintings and then sell shares in those paintings to you. Once the painting sells, you get paid based on the percentage of the painting that you own. So far, they have returned over $40 million to their investors. I am personally invested in one of their offerings, an iconic Banksy piece. I hope it appreciates in value. Let Masterworks send you a free report showing which investments have the potential to generate the highest returns. It's easy to join and there is no obligation to invest. Now, let's get back to the video. Antony and Cleopatra retreat to Alexandria, but it is only a matter of time before Augustus sends someone to finish them off. Who will do his dirty work is a young military officer named Octavian. His career has been financed by Augustus, and he owes his patron a great deal of gratitude. This is his opportunity to repay that debt, and he takes full advantage of it. Octavian lays siege to Alexandria, and when Antony learns that his lover has been captured, he kills himself. Cleopatra, however, is not ready to give up. She fakes her death and hides in a tomb. But when Octavian finds her, she realizes that it is over. Augustus has won, and she is now a prisoner of his. As a last-ditch effort, she tries to persuade Octavian to let her live by offering him a huge bribe, but he refuses. Even though he knows that Cleopatra is innocent, he cannot risk letting her go. If she lives, she will always be a threat to Augustus and the stability of the empire. And so Cleopatra is executed, and the reign of Augustus is secured. But that is not the end of the story. In fact, it is only the beginning. As I mentioned in the last episode, the relationship between Augustus and Cleopatra goes back much further than most people realize. When Caesar was assassinated, Augustus was one of the men who inherited his fortune. This made him incredibly wealthy, but it also made him a target. The other Roman senators feared that Caesar had chosen Augustus to be his heir, because he was the most powerful man in Rome. They wanted the inheritance for themselves, and they would stop at nothing to get it. Augustus realized that he was in danger, so he fled to the city of Brundisium. He stayed there for months, hiding in the house of a friend. But eventually, the senators sent assassins to kill him. Augustus barely escaped with his life. He had to leave Brundisium and flee to Athens in Greece. There, he lived incognito for several years, but all the while, he was plotting his revenge. He knew that the senators would never forgive him for what he did to them. So he decided to take the fight to them, and he started a civil war. It was a long and bloody conflict, but in the end, Augustus came out on top. He defeated his enemies and took control of the entire Roman world. And as we have seen, he wasted no time in consolidating his power. He appointed his friends to important positions, and he began a propaganda campaign to paint himself as the savior of Rome. But behind the scenes, Augustus was afraid that his enemies would come back and take everything away from him. He knew that the civil war had been costly, and that the Romans were tired of fighting. But he also knew that if he didn't stay vigilant, his enemies would exploit the people's weariness and start another war. So he kept a close eye on everyone around him, and he was always prepared for the worst. For example, when he heard that Antony and Cleopatra had become lovers, he was furious. He knew that Antony was one of the most powerful generals in Rome, and he was afraid that the two of them would team up and overthrow him. That's why he started the smear campaign against Cleopatra. He wanted to make her unpopular in Rome, so that Antony would be forced to choose between her and his career. And for the most part, it worked. The Romans did turn on Cleopatra, and Antony had to flee to Egypt with her. But then something unexpected happened. Antony killed himself, and Cleopatra faked her own death. This made Augustus very nervous. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't risk letting Cleopatra go, but he also didn't want to start another civil war. In the end, he chose to crush Cleopatra and end the threat she posed to him, and that is why he sent Octavian to Egypt to finish her off. As we have seen, Octavian was more than happy to do the job. He was eager to please his patron, and he knew that this was his chance to make a name for himself. But even though he was successful, Augustus was still afraid. He knew that the people of Rome would never accept him as their leader if they thought he was responsible for the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. That's why he did something very clever. After Cleopatra was dead, he released the love letters that Antony had written to her. This made it look like Cleopatra was the one who had betrayed Rome, and it turned the people of Rome against her. From that point on, Augustus was able to solidify his power and bring peace to the empire. He became the first emperor of Rome and ushered in a new era of prosperity and stability. Unfortunately, this would not last forever, because the seeds of discontent had already been planted. Augustus had crushed Cleopatra and her supporters, but there would always be other ambitious generals looking to take his power. And so the cycle of violence would continue. Thank you so much for watching. This is Chapter 7 of Rome, the Fall of an Empire, the final episode of the Republic arc. This chapter is called The Final War of the Republic. The year is 31 BC, and Rome has not fought a war like this in its entire history. The Roman Republic's final battle is about to begin. The mighty navies of two powerful factions are set to clash in a desperate struggle that will determine the fate of Rome itself. On one side is Octavian, the future Augustus, the last Republican to fight for the Senate. On the other side, the Egyptian pharaoh, Antony, and his lover, Cleopatra. Will the god of the Nile triumph over the last son of Rome? Find out as we continue our series, Rome, the Fall of an Empire. As always, if you would like to read along with the podcast, there are links in the description below where you can find the full text of the series free of charge. But now it is time to cast our gaze across the waves to Actium on the western coast of Greece, where the fleets of Octavian and Mark Antony are preparing for battle. This is the showdown everyone has been waiting for. The conflict between Caesar and Pompey. But on the sea, they say the Battle of Actium was fought over land. But the truth is that Actium was a battle decided by the seas. The year before, Antony and Cleopatra had taken their show on the road, setting up shop in Athens and forcing the city into a costly competition with Rome for the title of most extravagant capital in the Mediterranean. While the Egyptians may have won that competition, they suffered a defeat in the east. Actium, however, is a different story. For here, Agrippa has brought the full might of the Roman fleet to bear against the Egyptian invaders. And when the two sides finally clash, it is Agrippa, not Octavian, who leads the attack. The young Caesar is only present at Actium because his counselors convinced him he needed to be there. The real command has been handed to Agrippa, and from the first moment that Agrippa sees those crimson sails on the horizon, he knows he must act quickly. You see, thanks to intelligence gathered by spies in Alexandria, Agrippa already knows what the enemy's ships are carrying. Cleopatra and Antony, who have taken lovers and left their wives behind, are running away together. Agrippa does not want them to get away, so as soon as the battle begins, he uses fireships to cut off the Egyptian queen's escape. In the chaos that ensues, Agrippa chases after Cleopatra, hoping to capture her. Meanwhile, Octavian watches nervously from the shore. Every time he sees a vessel bearing Antony's colors, he thinks it might be his lover, but it never is. Instead, he is approached by an envoy from the Egyptians bearing a message from Antony. It's a bluff. Antony claims that Cleopatra is on her way to join him and demands Octavian stand down. If he doesn't, Antony threatens to kill her. Of course, Antony's bluff works, or at least it seems to. Octavian does not know whether to believe the messenger or not, so he sends word back that he will return Cleopatra unharmed. But even as he does so, he regrets his decision. What will people think, he asks himself, when they learn that he gave the enemy a queen for a bargaining chip? Well, whatever they think, he thinks back, it won't be as bad as if they learn that I let her go. Unharmed, Agrippa realizes that the battle is nearly over. Antony has fled, but the true victory belongs to Rome. Even though Octavian's men captured no enemy vessels and suffered many losses themselves, The fact that Antony and Cleopatra were able to sail away without Agrippa's interference is seen as a triumph for Rome. Octavian and Agrippa have accomplished what they set out to do: break the power of the Egyptians and force them to abandon their invasion of Greece. They have also, unknowingly, made preparations for the final act of the play. Back in Alexandria, Antony waits anxiously for the return of his fleet. He is expecting good news. Surely, he thinks, Agrippa and Octavian have killed each other's men by the thousands. Where is my fleet? Why haven't they come home? Does that mean Cleopatra has been captured? Has Agrippa betrayed me? As Antony paces the deck, he ignores the entreaties of his counselors, who tell him he should prepare to defend the city. Soon enough, he gets his answer. But it isn't the one he wanted to hear. The ships returning to Alexandria are empty. They carry no prisoners and no plunder. The only evidence that a battle took place is the damage they have sustained in the fighting. Then, just when Antony is losing all hope, he sees something in the distance, two familiar crimson sails. His heart skips a beat. Could it be? Yes, it is. There she is, my brave Cleopatra. She has come back for me. As the ships approach, Antony rushes to meet them, ignoring the warning shouts of his counselors, who now see what he refuses to, that the ships are damaged and empty. That's not Cleopatra's fleet, it's the ships he sent to Actium, and those aren't his soldiers rowing the oars. Those are slaves taken from the people of Actium. As the sun sets over Alexandria, Antony grows weaker and weaker. Now, his advisors realize that their master is mad with grief, but there is nothing they can do to stop him. And so Antony joins the throng of slaves, rowing the empty ships away from Actium. There is no more reason for him to live. With his fleet destroyed, he is now utterly alone. Soon enough, he hears the roar of the crowd on the shore. A welcoming committee has arrived to greet him. He lets out a hollow laugh. Welcome, he says to himself, to the greatest conqueror the world has ever known. At dawn the next morning, the people of Alexandria wake to the sight of their beloved pharaoh, walking slowly toward the shore. They cheer, but Antony cuts them off with a raised hand. Quiet, he says, listen to me. Then he begins to speak, but no sound comes out. The people look on in confusion. The pharaoh's throat is slit from ear to ear. Blood pours out onto the sand. He falls to his knees and collapses, dead at his feet. The people cry out in horror, but Antony doesn't care. He is dead, and in the minutes it takes for Cleopatra to arrive on the scene, someone else has claimed his life. The suicide of Mark Antony is only the beginning. We now shift our focus to the shores of the Red Sea, where Cleopatra and her sister await the arrival of two messengers. One brings bad news: the fleet is destroyed. The other, worse news: Antony is dead. Desperation overwhelms Cleopatra. She will not live in a world without Antony. She gives orders for a barge to be prepared, and then calls for her attendants to bring forward the asp. When her servants enter the room, they find her lying on a mat, dressed in royal robes. The asp coiled around her arm. She strokes its head gently. Here, she whispers, you have served me well. The asp strikes. The poison flows through her veins. She dies happy in the arms of her lover. When the news of their deaths reaches Rome, Octavian throws a feast in honor of the occasion. He invites 8 men of the Senate to his house and serves them dinner on golden plates while celebrating the end of the Republic. When the feast is over, he escorts the senators out the door. It's midnight by now, and the streets are dark and deserted. But as they walk, Octavian stops suddenly. Do you hear that? He asks. The senators strain their ears. What is that? The sound of chains dragging metal moans in the wind. Octavian turns to the senators. Come, he says, leading them deeper into the shadows. You are about to see the last ghost of the Republic. As they turn the corner, they see a group of chained men huddled in the darkness. Their faces are covered in grime. Their hair and beards hang long and unkempt. Who are these men? Octavian asks. These, says one of the senators, were once the leaders of Rome. This is the end of the Republic. It is now obvious why Octavian kept the Senate around during the civil wars. He knew there would be no peace until the ghosts of the Republic were laid to rest. And now that is done, too. As the last senator passes by, one of the chained men looks up, his eyes gleaming with hate. The Republic may be dead, but its spirit lives on, he says. One day you will pay for this. Octavian, you may have defeated us, but you will never defeat Rome. The ghost disappears into the night. All that is left is the distant sound of chains dragging. In the distance, Octavian smiles grimly. "You may be right," he says, "but I am the one who will decide when Rome rises again." Thank you for watching. To watch the next episode in the series, click here. To listen to the podcast, visit our website or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Links to all of these things are in the description below. Also, be sure to check out our community server if you want to chat with other fans of the channel and the podcast. Again, the link for that is in the description below. Finally, please like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Until the next episode, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it fell apart pretty quickly. Chapter 8, The Sole Master of Rome. August Octavian strode through the streets of Alexandria, his purple-clad form silhouetted against the sun as it dipped below the horizon. He had entered the city a conqueror, but today he was entering it as its master. Today, the city would become Rome's property, and in this moment, with thousands upon thousands of Alexandrians cheering his name from their balconies, he knew that there was no force on earth powerful enough to stop him. There was no one left who could challenge his claim to the whole of Italy. In the distance, the harbor bustled with activity as ships from all across the Mediterranean unloaded their cargo and as countless merchants made their way through the city, eager to get their business done before nightfall. All around him, Octavian saw the fruits of his victory over Antony and Cleopatra. The riches of the Nile Delta would flow into Rome's coffers now. The grain harvests of Egypt would soon feed the hungry mouths of his people. And most importantly, the fleets of Alexandria would swell the ranks of the Roman navy, making it the most powerful force at sea. Yet despite the wealth and splendor that surrounded him, his thoughts were back in Rome. He was eager to end this campaign and return home. He longed to see his mother again and to celebrate with the Roman people, who he knew would welcome him as their liberator. To be fair, after years of civil war, they probably wouldn't care how he took Rome. They just wanted someone new in charge. Someone strong who could bring them peace. And that man was him. He would give them peace. Yes, he decided, Rome would never go to war again. At least not while he was alive. He halted at the far end of the harbor and gestured for everyone to fall silent. The crowd hushed and stared up at him expectantly. This was the moment he had worked so long to achieve, the moment when he would fulfill his destiny and take his rightful place in history. What he said next would echo down the ages. Romans, citizens of Alexandria, people of Egypt, hear me. A hush fell over the crowds. I have come to end the civil wars that have ravaged our beloved Italy. Cheers rose from the crowd. They had suffered greatly during the recent civil war, and many were just glad that it would finally end. For too long, our brothers have been pitted against one another, killing and dying for causes that were long forgotten. It is time to put an end to this madness. More cheers. I offer you peace. Peace for all Romans, whether you live in Alexandria or Rome itself. Put your trust in me and I will not disappoint you. He paused, savoring the adulation of the crowds. For a brief moment, he basked in the cheers of the Alexandrians. They too had suffered greatly from the civil war, but now it seemed that everything was going to be all right. But then he raised a hand for silence once more. But we cannot truly enjoy this peace, he said, until we close the gates of war forever. Until we seal away the weapons of conflict and turn our swords into plowshares. Until we bind up the wounds of the past and turn our hearts toward the future. As he spoke, soldiers approached carrying a golden chain and two scythes. One scythe was old and well worn. It had been pulled from the depths of a temple, where it had been hidden for safekeeping. The other was brand new, crafted from the finest metal and polished to a blinding shine. With the crowd watching intently, Octavian took the two scythes and compared them. The old one represented the many wars Rome had fought in the past. The new one symbolized the peace he planned to usher in. Then, with a mighty effort, he used the chain to bind the two scythes together. The crowd gasped. They understood what he was doing. Then Octavian turned and walked toward the temple of Janus, the first temple anyone visiting Rome saw, built by his great-uncle Augustus, the first emperor. Its two facing doors symbolized Rome's ability to wage war on two fronts. For centuries, at least one of the doors had always remained open, marking Rome's state of perpetual warfare. But that was about to change. He entered the temple and stepped up to the altar. Here, before the statue of the two-faced god of transitions and doorways, he placed the scythes down. Then he turned back to face the crowds gathered outside. His voice rang out across the harbor, carrying over the waves to reach every ear. By the grace of the gods, I have come to close the gates of war forever. As you can see, I have bound the instruments of war together, the old and the new. Let the old one, the symbol of past conflicts, be sealed away in the temple of Janus. Let the new one, the symbol of our bright future, be cast into the sea. So help me, gods of Rome, as I do this, that the chains that bind these instruments of war may also bind us Romans together, that they may remind us of our glorious future, a future forged not in the fires of war, but in the bonds of peace and prosperity. As he spoke, soldiers moved forward and carried the new scythe toward the sea. The crowds watched in rapt silence as the soldiers cast the gleaming instrument of war into the waves, where it disappeared beneath the surface. Cheers erupted, shaking the very foundations of Alexandria. People danced in the streets and sang songs of triumph. In the distance, fireworks lit up the night sky like a Roman candle. Celebrating, Octavian smiled. This was his moment. But even as he reveled in the cheers of the Alexandrians, he couldn't help but think about Rome. He missed his mother terribly and wished he could be back in Rome celebrating with her. But he knew he couldn't leave just yet. There was still work to be done here in Alexandria. He still needed to sort out the affairs of the Egyptian kingdom and to secure the loyalty of the eastern provinces. Once that was done, though, he would return to Rome, and that thought alone made him want to speed the process along. He rode back to his palace, eager to start writing letters and sending couriers. He wanted to be back in Rome before the celebrations were over. Yet, as he entered his palace, he noticed something strange. The doors were shut. Since when did he order his doors to be closed? He pushed the door open and entered inside. A woman stood waiting for him in the shadows. She had dark skin, a shock of red hair piled atop her head, and fierce green eyes that glinted in the torchlight. Behind her stood 2 guards, their faces grim. Octavian recognized them as Egyptians, but he didn't know which pharaoh they served. Could this be Cleopatra? Had she somehow escaped his forces and was now hiding in his palace? The woman stepped forward, her lips curling into a smile. Octavian, Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Julius Caesar, and the most cunning general of our age, she said smoothly. Octavian's blood ran cold. How did she know his parentage, and how did she know so much about him? Before he could respond, the woman continued. Cleopatra, last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, greetings. Octavian, I presume you are surprised to see me here, she asked, tilting her head to one side. I must say that I am rather disappointed that you chose to besiege this city, instead of paying me a visit earlier. We could have saved ourselves a lot of trouble, don't you think? Cleopatra, Octavian replied slowly. You're not dead, she laughed, a musical sound that echoed through the room. Of course I'm not dead, Octavian. Why would you think that? Your brother told me that you died in battle. She sighed dramatically. Poor, naive boy, how easily you believe everything you are told. Did you really think I would die in battle when I had the chance to escape? Please, Octavian, do try to be more discerning in the future. Why are you here, Cleopatra? You should be dead. Why indeed? Cleopatra purred, stepping closer. Perhaps I am here because I am the only person who can help you solve the problems of this city. Or perhaps I'm here because I want to make a proposition to you. What kind of proposition? Oh, just a simple one, really. I want you to marry me. He stared back at her in disbelief. What? Don't tell me you weren't expecting this, Octavian. After all, we have been courting for months now. Our families have been negotiating a marriage between us for years. Don't you remember the letter that Antony sent you asking for my hand in marriage? Or how you responded by invading Egypt and besieging my capital city? He shook his head. I refuse. She pouted. Oh, come now, Octavian, surely you jest. Think of how beneficial a marriage between us would be. I could help you rule over the eastern provinces. Together we could bring peace and stability to the entire Mediterranean. We could be like Augustus and Livia, Augustus and you. He stiffened. My mother and father were wed by the will of the gods. My destiny is not to be decided by some scheming Egyptian queen, she gasped. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? I am Cleopatra, daughter of the most divine line in all of Egypt, a descendant of Alexander the Great himself. To spurn me is to spurn royalty. To reject me is to reject the future of Rome. Beware, Cleopatra, he warned. You may have escaped the siege, but you are trapped now. There is no escape for you here. We shall see, Octavian, she said softly. We shall see. He turned and strode away, leaving her standing there in the darkness. He would deal with her later. Right now, He had more important matters to attend to. He needed to send word back to Rome. Soon the whole city would be celebrating his victory. And when he returned, they would crown him their new master. He would be Rome's first true emperor. Hello, my friends. This is your host for Crash Course, Ancient History. And yes, we are still talking about Rome, although we're now over 30 years into the rule of Augustus and the Julio-Claudians. Now, in Chapter 9, we get to see how he got started. So, let's get into it. We begin this chapter with an epigraph from a letter that Cassius Dio wrote about Augustus during his reign. And it's interesting because it explains that even though Augustus was a king, he preferred not to be called that. He thought it would mean that he wasn't governing according to the laws. But if you were to call him divine, then he wouldn't mind at all. And that's a clue as to what we're going to learn in this chapter. Augustus wanted to keep up the appearance that Rome was still a republic, but he also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that he was divine. In 27 BCE, Octavian went before the Senate and pretended like he didn't want to be a king. See, since defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony in the Civil War, he'd taken the title of Augustus from the Egyptian pantheon. But still, he claimed that he didn't want to be a king and insisted that Rome should remain a republic. But of course, he also asked the Senate to grant him a special title so that his power would be recognized. He said that if they gave him the title of Augustus, it would appear as if he had been made godlike by the Senate. And look, it totally worked. They did it. And the Senate granted him the title Augustus, which meant great, awesome one. The title was a subtle enough change that it could be used within republican traditions, but it was clear enough that he was different than a normal magistrate. Like the title didn't come with any special emoluments or salary, but he was expected to be treated with special reverence. For example, when people greeted him, they were supposed to turn away from their business and give him their full attention. And it also came with a special salute. Instead of the customary Ave, which just means hello, people were now supposed to say Avenue, Augustus, or Lec Mitch, so there was no mistaking who was boss. This was a brilliant move by Octavian. By pretending like he didn't want to be a king, but accepting the title of Augustus, he was able to convince the Romans that he was restoring the Republic while making himself supreme ruler at the same time. And that move marked the beginning of the Principate, a period in Roman history when power was concentrated in the hands of one person, but it was disguised under the traditions of the Republic. And honestly, that disguise lasted for centuries. But don't worry, we'll get to talk about more of that later. Let's finish telling the story of how the disguise began. So when the Senate gave him the title of Augustus, it created a bit of a situation. You see, Rome had these laws that said that you couldn't hold two offices at once, and Augustus held the title of tribune, and he'd already accepted the title of Augustus, which was given to him by the Senate, not by the people. And those titles were contradictory. To fix that problem, Octavian asked the people to vote him the title of Augustus instead. He campaigned for the vote by saying that he deserved the title because he defeated the armies of 3 kings, referring to King Pharnacus of Pontus, King Tigranes, the Great of Armenia, and of course King Charles XIII of Egypt. And once he won that vote, he officially became Augustus, first among equals. So Augustus was now the most powerful guy in Rome. But what exactly did that mean? Well, he still had to share power with a lot of people. You see, when Julius Caesar had been assassinated, the city had been governed by a triumvirate. Then, after Octavian defeated Mark Antony, he'd been governing along with Marcus Agrippa and the adopted son of Caesar, also named Octavian. It was still like that, but now Augustus was the first of equals. And that meant that he could appoint people to oversee the provinces. And that was a big deal because until that point, the consuls had shared power with the other members of the triumvirate, but now only Augustus could assign the governors. And so with that new power, he divided the empire into parts that he controlled directly and parts that were governed by loyal allies. For example, Augustus gave the province of Cisalpine Gaul to his sister Octavia as a kind of wedding gift, but he kept effective control over it. When she married the guy that he wanted her to marry, he also gave the province of Hispania, Tarraconensis, to his uncle, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was still technically one of the triumvirs. But Augustus effectively demoted him by giving him a boring province far away from Rome. And Augustus kept effective control over the rest of the provinces. And while Augustus was busy reshaping the government, Agrippa was hard at work reshaping Rome. We talked about some of this in Chapter 8, like how he reorganized the fire-ravaged city, but he also built new public buildings and expanded Rome's infrastructure. Under Augustus, Rome was quickly becoming a modern city, with aqueducts, sewers, paved roads, and public transportation. Meanwhile, Augustus's wife, Scribonia, was busy giving him a son, the future Tiberius. And while Scribonia didn't stick around long as Augustus's wife, she did stick around long enough to get him an heir, which was really important for Augustus. You see, the Julio-Claudians never took women as their lovers, only the prostitutes that were forced into sexual slavery with them. And so they had to take wives and make sure that their wives bore them children, so that they could continue the dynasty. That's why Augustus's first marriage to Scribonia only lasted 3 years. She gave him a son, and then he sent her off to live on a farm. But he did marry a woman named Livia Drusilla, who gave him a daughter, then another son, then a stepson, and then another grandson. So you know, just in case something happened to Tiberius, Augustus made sure he had other options. And those weren't the only family connections he made. You see, Augustus wanted to make sure that he didn't have any enemies. So he made alliances by marrying people into other influential families. For example, his sister Octavia was married to that guy that we mentioned earlier, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. But he also married his daughter Julia, the elder, to his former general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, and he set up another marriage between his daughter Julia the younger and his adopted son Tiberius. These marriages created a tangled web of connections that bound together many of the elite families in Rome, thus increasing Augustus's power. And yet, despite all these brilliant moves that Augustus made to secure his position, he wasn't done. Not at all. In fact, in 23 BCE, he passed the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, a law that required wealthy Romans to marry and have kids. His advisors told him that it was probably unconstitutional, but he passed it anyway because he was worried that there weren't enough heirs to carry on the existing dynasties of Rome. And that worried him because he believed that Rome's stability depended upon the support of the elite families. But Augustus's solution ended up creating new problems. For example, the law forced the Balb, the Claudia and the Julia gens to break up, because no one in those families wanted to marry someone else in those families. And that caused all sorts of political headaches for Augustus. But on top of all that, Rome was facing economic trouble because the cost of grain had skyrocketed, and Augustus tried to solve that problem by taking grain from the provinces and giving it to the poor in Rome. He also instituted a kind of welfare program where he paid poor women to stay home and have babies, and that helped increase the population of Rome, but it didn't help the economy. So in 22 BCE, he appointed a man named Gaius Caesar as his deputy to deal with the financial crisis. And that appointment created another problem, because Gaius Caesar was related to Augustus in a bunch of ways. He was Augustus's nephew, but he was also the son of Augustus's recently deceased daughter, Julia the Elder. This meant that there was a chance that he was Augustus's legitimate heir, and that created all sorts of tension. For example, at the Ludi Romani in 22 BCE, Augustus entered the race for a chariot race, and the crowd broke out into cheers when Gaius Caesar entered the stadium. It was a humiliating experience for Augustus. His propaganda team responded by launching a smear campaign against the young Caesar, and they claimed that he was gay. And that didn't go well either, because people loved Gaius Caesar even more after that. So in 19 BCE, Augustus decided to exile his own nephew and stepson, and that led to protests. Again, the people seemed to love the exiled guys. So Augustus brought them back, but he kept them far from Rome and gave them unimportant tasks. Still, though, the people loved them, which made Augustus nervous. Okay, when we left off last time, Augustus had just fought a war against the nomadic people in the deserts of Arabia. He hadn't beaten them, but he did receive ambassadors from them, and they wanted to make peace. Augustus's advisors told him to accept the peace offering, because he didn't need to start another war. But again, Augustus was nervous about the loyalty of the people of Rome, so he planned a triumph to celebrate his victory over the Nabateans. He scheduled the celebration for the same day that his stepson, Gaius Caesar, was celebrating his victory over the Parthians, and when the day arrived, he showed up wearing his war regalia. He rode in on a golden chariot drawn by elephants, and he wore a crown of oak leaves. He also had 4 kings paraded in front of him, and he rode on a golden throne through the streets of Rome. It was a stunning display of wealth and power. and it totally intimidated Rome's citizens. No one dared to protest Augustus's actions, and his triumph was celebrated every year after that. And with the people on his side, Augustus felt confident enough to finally defeat his last rival, Sextus Pompey, the son of Gnaeus Pompey the Great. All that was left was to cement Augustus's power as the first emperor of Rome. Click here to watch this entire chapter as an episode of our show. Want to review some vocabulary from this episode? Click here to visit our site. Want to watch Crash Course, Ancient History, ad-free? It's a win-win. Chapter 10, Reorganizing the Roman State. Augustus had come to power in the midst of a civil war. He'd fought against Mark Antony and Cleopatra and won, but at what cost? Civil wars were expensive and destabilizing. Augustus was keen to make sure there wouldn't be any more, and so he spent his reign reorganizing the Roman state to make sure that it would last. That's what we're going to look at today. Now, if you want more details about the early Julio-Claudian dynasty, then check out the series on the Julio-Claudians, starting with Claudius on the channel. But I'm guessing that you are here for Rome in general, so let's get into it. So this chapter is all about how Augustus reorganized the Roman state after the civil wars. This can seem like a pretty dry topic, but it is important because these administrative reforms are what allowed Rome to go from a small Italian city-state to a sprawling Mediterranean empire. So let's break this down into 3 parts: administrative reforms, control of the military, and preventing civil wars. Let's start with the administrative reforms. Augustus didn't change the structure of the Roman Republic, but he did make a few tweaks. The biggest one being that he established a number of imperial provinces directly controlled by the Senate. Now, previously most of Italy and the Western Mediterranean was controlled by the Senate, but many of Rome's eastern provinces were not. They were either client kingdoms or they were ruled by former generals who demade their own armies during the civil wars. Augustus wanted to change this, so when he went to conquer Egypt in 32 BC, he annexed it as a province. The next year he did the same with the kingdom of Pontus, and over time he reduced or eliminated the number of client kings in the east, replacing them with imperial provinces governed by appointed senators. By the end of his reign, Rome was governing around 27 provinces, including those within Italy. These were known as the provinces of the empire. They were directly ruled by Rome and were the source of its revenue, providing both grain and other goods, as well as manpower for the army. Augustus also set up senatorial administration in these provinces, sending a governor and drawing administrators and officials from the senator class. Senators were generally wealthy enough to run a province as a business, paying for its administration themselves and skimming the profits off the top. Now, this wasn't a perfect system. It was often difficult to find enough senators to govern all the provinces, and there were problems with corruption and extortion, but it worked well enough for Augustus. The second big reform Augustus implemented was establishing a professional permanent army. Before Augustus, Rome's armies were raised and organized by individual generals, raised by wealthy Romans called the equites or knights, and then led by former knights and senators. It was a very stopgap measure and relied heavily on the goodwill of Rome's allies. After the civil wars, Rome could no longer rely on that goodwill. Its allies saw what had happened during the conflict and wanted to protect themselves. So Rome needed a new way of raising troops. Augustus created 4 legions of elite soldiers, the Praetorian Guard, which guarded the person of the emperor and maintained order in Rome. 3 legions of the Praetorian Guard were stationed in and around the capital, while the 4th served as an elite shock troop force. The Praetorians were recruited from veterans of the civil wars, men who'd seen combat and knew how to fight, but they were also loyal to Augustus personally, having fought for him in the civil wars, so it was a good move. He also had them administer the census, collect taxes, and guard the approaches to the river, tunnels, aqueducts, and bridges. This was a strategic move to keep them busy and away from politics. Finally, he kept their pay high, housing them close to the city and giving them generous retirement packages. Augustus also increased the size of the standing army from 8 to 25 legions, and instead of relying on allies to raise troops, he paid for the army himself out of the imperial treasury, taking the money out of the provincial revenues. Now, this was important for 2 reasons. First, it removed a dependence on allies, those fickle people who switched sides during civil wars. And secondly, it gave the emperor control over the finances of the state. Augustus was now firmly in charge of Rome, And that brings us to the third point, preventing civil wars. The entire point of these administrative and financial reforms was to make sure that there would be no more civil wars. Augustus had lived through 2 of them, Caesar had lived through 1, and Cicero had lived through 2. Everyone knew that civil wars were terrible. Augustus didn't do anything specifically to prevent civil wars, but everything he did had that as an underlying current. For example, he appointed governors to the provinces. This might seem like a small thing, but it was actually really important because it prevented powerful figures from having their own armies. If you're a senator, you can become governor of a province. You'll have your own military forces, but they're small and they're not yours personally. They belong to Rome, and when you finish your governorship, you hand over the legions to the next guy. But Augustus took it further. He reorganized the Senate itself, creating a class of younger men who were excluded from the Senate. This ensured that there were always fresh faces coming into the Senate, people who hadn't been there when Augustus seized power. Augustus also got rid of the assemblies and replaced them with the Council of the Elders or the Senate. Under the Republic, voting was done in the assemblies, but they were often manipulated by the most popular leaders who used their influence to get votes for laws and for elections. But Augustus bypassed the assemblies, pushing legislation through the Senate instead, where he had more direct control. Augustus also passed a law barring family members of his from adopting the name of Augustus. The idea was to create a clear line of succession and to limit future emperors to the Julian-Claudian family. Augustus's reforms did work. There were no large-scale civil wars during the rule of the Julio-Claudians, though some emperors were certainly more popular than others. The Julio-Claudians also faced threats from outside Rome, rebellions on the borders and invasions in Germany and across the Rhine, but none of them were successful. The Julio-Claudians were able to beat back external threats thanks to the changes that Augustus had made to the army. The Praetorian Guard stopped civil wars in Rome, keeping the peace at home, and Augustus achieved his goal of creating a stable empire. Now I know that this isn't as dramatic as battles and sackings, but administrative reforms are just as important. In fact, without them, Rome couldn't have survived. As Augustus aged, he became increasingly frustrated that none of his sons were born of his wife, Livia, and he began to worry about the question of succession. His stepson, Tiberius, was the obvious choice. He was the eldest of his children and had proved himself competent during the civil wars, but he was a bit too old. And Augustus had noticed the ambitions of his grandson, also called Augustus. But he was even older and already getting a reputation for being greedy and cruel. Augustus's daughter Julia was another possibility. She was young and beautiful and married to a former general, but she was also impossible. Augustus eventually chose Tiberius, and the adoption was formalized in 04 AD. From then on, Tiberius was known as Tiberius Caesar. After Augustus' death in 14 AD, Tiberius was declared Augustus's heir and assumed the title of Imperator. He was the first emperor to rule under that title alone. We think that Augustus would have preferred to rule with the title Princeps, but he may have thought that Imperator would remind people of the republican tradition, of military commanders taking that title before marching on Rome. Augustus didn't want to seem like a conqueror, but whatever his thoughts, the title stuck and it was used by every emperor after him. Tiberius had fought alongside his father, Julius Caesar, in the Gallic Wars and during the Civil War. He'd shown himself to be a capable leader, and despite his age, he proved to be a good administrator. Unfortunately, he was also a tyrant, ruling with paranoia and cruelty. He mistrusted his advisors and alienated many powerful families, including those of his own family, the Julio-Claudians. He also lost the support of the Praetorian Guard, who murdered his adopted brother, Germanicus, believing that he was next in line to Tiberius. So towards the end of his reign, he had to flee Rome to avoid assassination. Instead, he settled on Capri, where he built a pleasure boat and prostituted himself. Tiberius died in 37 AD, and with him, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. So that was a quick summary of chapters 9 and 10. In the next episode, we'll be looking at Caligula, the third emperor of Rome. You can find links to all my sources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. Thank you to my supporters for making these videos possible. You can find links to my support page in the description below. Special thanks to my highest tier supporters. Thanks for watching. Bye. Okay, it's time to talk about chapter 11. The Pax Romana Begins. And if you need a review packet, by the way, with all the chapter outlines and maps and everything, you could possibly need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, click right here in the description or up above. You can get a full review packet, which is going to help you so much. It's got all my notes, all the chapter outlines, all the maps, everything you need in one neat little packet. And don't forget, if you want to get extra help, you can always click the link in the description to sign up for my virtual office hours. Come see me and we can go through any of this material, and you can ask me any questions you have. So sign up for that. Also, if you need help in math, help in science, help in any other subject, check out my website. The link is down below. It's where I post all my extra helpful videos, including how to get an A in advanced placement, government, and politics. So click on that link and hopefully you'll find something useful. And now, let's get to chapter 11. Remember, you've got this. I've got faith in you. Let's do this. Okay, welcome to chapter 11. As you know, the long-awaited peace has arrived. The civil wars are over. Octavian has defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And now the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, is ready to rule. So what's going to happen? Well, first of all, he is going to establish the Pax Romana. This is a period of like 200 years of peace and prosperity for Rome, although it doesn't really start until the reign of Augustus' successor, Tiberius. But anyway, Augustus is definitely associated with the Pax Romana. He's associated with this period of peace and prosperity, although he did wage a few wars. He did fight a war against the Germanic people on the northern border of the empire, and he fought against the kings of Armenia and some other places in the east. But generally speaking, his foreign policy was very cautious. In fact, Augustus actually reduced taxes, built roads, built aqueducts, founded new colonies. He established a professional civil service and reorganized the military. All these things brought stability and prosperity to Rome, and as you can imagine, after decades of civil war, that's exactly what they needed. They needed stability and prosperity. But anyway, Rome was at peace with almost everybody. They were not expanding their territory, but they did have control from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, which is an enormous amount of land. And Augustus ruled over that land, as well as Egypt, which was a kingdom in name only, but Rome controlled it. Anyway, the second king of Armenia, Tigranes II, tried to declare independence from Rome, but his army was defeated and Armenia became a client state of Rome. And also Augustus expanded the empire into modern Germany, or he sent a guy named Drusus into modern Germany, and Drusus campaigned along the Rhine River and pushed the Germanic people back. But the point is, Augustus did not conquer Germany. He didn't really want to. Instead, he set the borders of the empire at the Rhine and the Danube rivers, which is quite a bit different than the borders of the empire in 27 BC, when Augustus received the kingdom from his uncle. Now, in the east, the Parthians had taken the Roman province of Media, and so Augustus sent a general named Cassius to try to take it back, and Cassius was successful. He defeated the Parthians and retook Media now. It was during this campaign that Antony had fled to the Parthians and asked for assistance in order to defeat Octavian, and that's why the Parthians had possession of that province in the first place. But Augustus got it back. Augustus also made one significant change to the Roman Senate. He established the Principate, which was a new type of government that had the emperor at the head, but the Senate still played a major role. The Senate appointed the emperor. The emperor did not come to power through inheritance. They were appointed by the Senate, and the emperor was supposed to rule with the consent of the Senate and the best interest of the Roman people in mind. In theory, that's how it worked. And then Augustus retired to his farm and wrote his memoirs. He died in AD 14, and his adopted son Tiberius came to power next. Now, I said adopted son, and you might be saying, wait a minute, didn't Julius Caesar adopt Octavian? Yeah, he did. So who's the adopted son? Well, Augustus had a son, but he died young, and so Augustus adopted his brother's son, who was named Tiberius. And then when Tiberius became emperor, he adopted his son, Caligula, and then Caligula adopted his son, Claudius, and then Claudius adopted Nero. So there you have it. You've got Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. That's your Julio-Claudian dynasty. Anyway, while Augustus was writing his memoirs, he was painting a picture of how he came to power and how wonderful he was and how he brought peace and prosperity to Rome. He wanted future emperors to kind of follow his model, to present themselves in the same way. And so when Tiberius came to power, he tried to emulate Augustus, and he was pretty successful at it, especially at first. But as time went on, he became more and more tyrannical. So the Julio-Claudians, starting with Tiberius, continued Augustus's policies, primarily the policy of maintaining peace. And that's part of the reason that the Pax Romana lasted for 200 years. Because these emperors were very interested in keeping the peace, at least at first. Tiberius kept the peace. Caligula kept the peace, even though he was a bit of a tyrant. And then came Claudius. Claudius was a weak emperor. He was not particularly bright. He wasn't particularly handsome. He wasn't particularly talented. He stumbled into becoming emperor after his brother Caligula was assassinated. And so Claudius didn't really know what he was doing. But he did have one significant accomplishment. He completed the conquest of Britain. Before him, his father, his uncle, and his brother had all attempted to conquer Britain, but they had been unsuccessful. Claudius came along and he just sort of accidentally happened to conquer Britain, but he did. And so that was one significant accomplishment of his reign. Then came Nero. Nero was perhaps the worst of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and he was certainly the most well-known. He was infamous for his excesses, for his cruelty, for his, wild parties and all that stuff. But his mother, Agrippina, the younger, she was really the one running Rome. She had married her uncle, who was the emperor at the time, and then she divorced him and married her own son, Nero, and so she was really the one pulling the strings of the Roman Empire. But she was eventually beheaded at the orders of Nero, and then Nero turned on his stepsister and ordered her to commit suicide. Then he decided to burn Rome to the ground. That's right. Nero burned Rome in AD 64. Most historians believe that he started the fire accidentally, but whatever the case may be, he took advantage of the situation. He kicked people out of their homes, bought up their property at ridiculously low prices, and rebuilt Rome in his own image. He built a huge palace complex for himself, and he built roads and aqueducts and public buildings, and all these things that were meant to glorify him. And the citizens of Rome were like, okay, well, here's our city, we love it, thank you for rebuilding it. And Nero was like, no problem. But really what he was trying to do was make sure that everybody thought he was great. And it worked. I mean, he wasn't a bad-looking guy. He liked the arts. He played the lyre. He was pretty good at that. He was athletic. He liked to race chariots. He liked to wrestle. I mean, he wasn't all bad, but he was a tyrant, and his excesses ultimately led to the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So there you have it. That's chapter 11. If you want to keep reviewing, keep going. Click right here and we'll keep on going. The great thing about living in the 21st century is that we have so much information at our fingertips. All of these videos wouldn't be possible without good internet. But what did they use back before the days of the internets? They used books. And speaking of books, today we are discussing chapter 12, Augustus the Builder. So let's get started. In this chapter, we focus on all of the building projects that were completed during Augustus' reign. He built forums, temples, roads, aqueducts, basically everything. At the end of the chapter, there's a nice little summation paragraph explaining why Augustus focused on these public works. To put it simply, he wanted to show off how stable and powerful Rome was under his rule. So with that in mind, let's start in the Forum of Augustus, which is conveniently right next to the Forum of Caesar. I mean, it would be rude not to, right? Augustus' Forum was dedicated into BC, and it was built on the marshy land reclaimed from the nearby Tiber River. It was also built over the Forum of Caesar, but on top of that, he had an entire hill artificially raised to make room for this new project. And even though it was called the Forum of Augustus, it wasn't just his forum, it was also a forum for all of the people in the second cohort of the Augustals, which was made up of freed slaves who were granted land and freedom for their service to Augustus. You know, remember that whole thing I said about free real estate in the last video? Yeah, Augustus definitely took advantage of that perk. The Forum of Augustus was flanked by two temples on either side, one dedicated to Mars the Younger and another to Minerva. In the center, there was a large semicircular basin surrounded by statues of Augustus' ancestors. This was meant to symbolize the return of Rome to its former glory days under the kings of old. I mean, come on, how meta is that? From there, we move on to something called the Heir, or the Altar of Peace, which was dedicated in 13 B.C. and was located at the end of the Via Flaminia, near the Piazza del Popolo. The Arapacis was actually a pretty big deal, because it marked the end of hostilities with those pesky Parthians. We talked about them in Chapter 8. It also marked the start of the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which was a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity throughout the empire. And to celebrate that, Augustus went all out on this altar. There were some pretty fancy reliefs decorating the monument. They depicted processions honoring both the emperor and the goddess of peace. They also showed scenes from nature, probably because Augustus wanted everyone to know that war was over and nature could finally flourish again. A small but interesting detail here is that they castrated all of the male figures to avoid any accusations of impropriety. Maybe that's why they called it the Roman peace. Anyway, after it was built, the Arapacis became the location of important civic and religious festivals. Next, we have the roads. Remember how in Chapter 10 we talked about how terrible the roads were and how dangerous travel was? Well, Augustus decided to do something about that. He built roads and bridges all over Italy and beyond. Most notably, he constructed the Via Appia, a 350-mile road that stretched from the city of Rome to the town of Brindisi, which was the main port for crossing over to Greece. It took 4 years to complete, and it cut travel time from weeks to only 2 days. Can you imagine being stuck on a boat for weeks with no air conditioning? That sounds horrible. No thank you. And while we're talking about roads, let's discuss the aqueducts. Rome didn't have running water like modern-day plumbing, but they did have aqueducts, which were a series of channels and reservoirs that carried water from the hills outside of the city into the city. The first aqueduct that Augustus built was the Aqua Virgo, which supplied water to the Forum of Augustus, the Pantheon, and the nearby Piazza Navona. This aqueduct was actually quite impressive because it used a siphon to carry water over a valley. Augustus also built the Aqua Marcia, which supplied water to the baths of the emperor and other parts of central Rome. His most ambitious aqueduct was the Aqua Virgo, which supplied water to the baths of Caracalla and the Colosseum. And lastly, he repaired and extended the Aqua Appia, which was Rome's oldest aqueduct. These aqueducts provided clean water for drinking, bathing and watering crops in the Roman countryside. Lastly, there was the harbour at Ostia. So Ostia was the port city for Rome. It was located where the Tiber River met the sea. Augustus undertook a massive building project there, constructing new docks, warehouses, and other facilities to support the growing trade of the empire. He also built a lighthouse to help ships navigate the treacherous waters of the Tiber River. So now we come to the famous quote, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." So okay, maybe that's not actually the real quote. That's the English translation of it. In Latin, it goes, Lec, Mitch, im Wallfish, or something like that. Just kidding. It's actually Libertus, Urbic, Inculta Fecit. Don't ask me how to say that. I can barely speak English. But anyway, this was actually written by one of Augustus's contemporaries, the poet Horace, and it means that he found Rome a rough and tumble city and made it a polished and sophisticated one. This idea of Rome being a city of brick is probably a reference to the buildings of wood and brick that were destroyed in the fire of 64. Rome was never a city of marble in the sense that marble was very expensive and rare. Most buildings were still made of brick or stone. Augustus changed that, though, by commissioning many buildings and monuments made entirely of marble. The most famous examples are probably the Pantheon and the Arapacis. But wait, there's more. If you want to keep learning about ancient Rome, check out the series Ancient Rome Explained. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, I don't know. Maybe you like learning about ancient Rome. Also, there's a video on the building of the Pantheon, which is actually quite fascinating. Or maybe you just want to support the channel. All of the above apply here. So go ahead and check it out. The link is in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching. Yeah, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to look at Chapter 13, Religion, Morality, and Family Values. So if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, whatever, drop them below. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. If you liked the video, give it a big thumbs up. It helps more than you know. And with that, let's jump into it. Alright, welcome to the show. Remember to support us by liking and subscribing, so that we can take over and end all of this fake news. Okay, let's get started. Augustus is not only a military commander, a shrewd politician, a cunning diplomat, he's also a religious man. In fact, at one point they even call him the most religious man in Rome. He took his role as Pontifex Maximus very seriously and used it to legitimize his rule. As a matter of fact, when he was in Gaul, he actually ordered for the books of the Gallic Druids to be burned, because he considered their practices, including human sacrifice, to be barbaric. But once he came to power, he completely reversed the trend of Roman polytheism turning towards the traditional gods of Rome, and he revived the old Roman morality with its emphasis on duty and order and tradition and piety. Now, after he defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, he returned to Rome in triumph and was greeted like a god. Actually, at least in Plutarch's telling, we have this depiction of the scene here. They call him the savior, the liberator, the benefactor, the father of his country. And the first thing he did was to go to the temple of Apollo in the Palatine Hill, which is also where his own house was, and he sacrificed an offering to Apollo and to the other gods and thanked them for his safe return and victory. And then the next day, he went to the temple of Jupiter Optimus, which was in the Capitol building, and there he made a similar sacrifice, but also offered 1,000 golden and 2,000 silver and bronze vessels that he had taken from Cleopatra's fleet. So he goes to these two temples, and he gives thanks to the gods. Not only did he give thanks to the gods for the victory, but also he presents them with gifts. It's just like you might have a birthday party, and maybe you give some sort of gift to the host for hosting your party at their house. This is kind of like that. These are his offerings to the gods, and in doing so, he established a clear connection between himself and the gods. He saw himself as a servant of the gods, and he also gave the impression that the gods were very much on his side. And this was very important because he ruled with divine authority. But he also claimed that he didn't want to be considered a god. He was a servant of the gods, but not a god himself. And this goes back to chapter 1, where we see how Octavian changes his name to Augustus, and how that was really significant, because Augustus was not a title that could be held by a god. Only a human could hold the title Augustus. And so in taking this new title, he was distancing himself from being considered a god, but rather a servant of the gods. We see the effect of this transformation immediately when he enters the city, because soon as he is inside the city walls, he disbands his army, lays down his weapons, and takes on the toga. And from that moment on, he's no longer the military leader, he's now the civilian magistrate. He leaves the battlefield, and he enters into politics. His soldiers will remain outside the city limits in their camps until their time was up, and then they would be discharged. The idea here is that Rome was protected by the gods, especially Minerva, who was the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, and she did not want her sacred soil to be polluted by bloodshed. This right here is a sculpture of Minerva in the Capitoline museums. Now the ancient Romans believed that blood pollution defiled the soil and water, which made it dangerous or unhealthy to use that land or that water, especially for religious purposes. You can see how in Virgil's Aeneid, how the heroes often need to purify themselves before they can approach a temple or altar. You can also think of how in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Caesar says that the soothsayer said, "Beware the Ides of March," and then he says, "Why, man, he's a dreamer. There's nothing he can do about it." Well, in fact, the soothsayer's prediction came true, and Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March. Blood pollution was a real problem. But one thing that happened during the civil wars was that blood soaked into the soil around Rome. And that was a bad omen because you couldn't use that soil for sacrifices anymore. That was taboo. It was forbidden. And that's what Augustus wanted to change. He wanted people to feel comfortable going back to the traditional gods of Rome. And so he commissioned a purification ritual to cleanse the soil of Rome from all this bloodshed. And it worked. People did go back to the traditional gods. You know, the civil wars had really disrupted that. And they also turned towards morality, because that was another thing that was lacking during the late Republic. It was a time of great immorality. There was debauchery and lewdness and corruption. People abandoned their wives and their children and their parents and had multiple divorces and remarriages. But Augustus really tried to restore that old Roman virtue that had been lacking during the late Republic. In fact, he passed a law that forbade marriages between close relatives and also forbade the divorce of a pregnant wife. He was always trying to cultivate this image of the perfect Roman, the moral Roman, the virtuous Roman, and he wanted to be seen as the epitome of that. In fact, his stepdaughter Julia, who was married to his adopted son Tiberius, well, She had a bit of a reputation. Let's say she was known for having affairs, and so Augustus divorced her so that he could marry her to another man. And that's something he would never have done if it wasn't so public. His goal was to create a dynasty, not only a dynasty of rulers, but a dynasty of exemplary citizens who ruled with morality and with religion. He wanted to make Rome great again by returning to its old values. But unfortunately, Tiberius was not quite up to par with these high standards, which led to some friction between Augustus and Tiberius. There is this story about Tiberius when he came back from Germany as a young man, and he was welcomed in Rome with a triumph. And during the celebration, he rode on a chariot like a god, like a triumph, and he was wearing a purple robe, and Augustus was very upset about that. In fact, he wrote in this letter saying, "My dear brother, how good it would be if you would not wish to appear to yourself or others to be anything other than what you are, a private citizen. For it is sufficient for me alone to be the object of the public gaze. Give me leave to say this, since it concerns us both. Do not desire to seem what you are not, lest it happen that in wishing to be thought great, you are thought the reverse." It's almost like Augustus is writing to him like, "Listen, you're my stepson. You don't have to worry about winning the approval of the people, because I already got that secured. You don't need to try to impress anyone. You just be you. Don't be someone that you're not. You know, you won't have to live up to this standard of a god, because I am the one that's supposed to be the example of Rome, not you." And this brings out the greatness of Augustus, because he realized that to build a dynasty, to build a new empire, he needed heirs, and he knew that those heirs wouldn't be able to live up to his standards, at least not right away. So he had to mold them, guide them, correct them, discipline them, and then set them on the path to greatness. Like imagine if you were a parent and your kid was running around the house naked and covered in mud. You probably wouldn't yell at them and punish them. Instead, you would probably try to explain to them, "Hey, this is why we wear clothes and this is why we don't play in the mud. You understand?" You're trying to teach them why certain things are the way they are, why there's certain laws and customs and traditions. And in the same way, Augustus was doing that with Tiberius. He was trying to teach him why certain things were the way they were, so that he could set Rome on the path to greatness, not just for himself, but for his heirs as well. And that's what we'll continue to explore next time on The History Guy. See you then. This is The History of Rome, Part 6, The Julio-Claudians, Chapter 14, Personal Life and Succession Struggles. The year is 12 AD, and it's been a decade since Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, and so far he's done a good job of ruling the empire. There have been some rebellions that threatened to undo the work of the late Republic, but were defeated. Augustus has expanded Roman territory into modern Belgium and northern Germany, annexed Rhaetia, made Dacia a province, and even waged war against the dreaded Parthians in the east. And now, with all of these new lands, Augustus has found himself in possession of a large amount of treasure. He's building new temples, refurbishing old ones, making huge public works projects throughout the city of Rome itself, and even paying off the entire debt incurred by the late Republic before it went to war with itself. But what worries him most of all is who will succeed him. His adopted son and original heir, Marcus Caesar Marcellus, has died at the age of 23 from an unknown illness, which leaves Augustus with no clear successor. But there is one other member of his family who is eligible. His daughter Julia, the sister of Marcellus, was married to the recently deceased Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man and the most important general during the civil wars. Julia and Agrippa had 2 sons together, Gaius and Lucius. So really, according to Roman custom, they should be considered the first in line to rule the empire after Augustus, unless, of course, Augustus decides otherwise. So let's take a look at their lives. The elder of the 2 boys, Gaius, was born in 12 BC. When he was just 2 years old, his mother Julia was sent away by Augustus because she had an affair with a senator named Cornelius. Not a big deal. It happens to the best of us. But because her husband Agrippa was a military commander in the east, he didn't get the memo. So when he returned to Rome to find his wife cozying up to another guy, he was pretty pissed. Agrippa was not a fan of sharing and ordered Cornelia killed and then kicked Julia out of the household. No word on whether or not she went to live with her father Augustus, or if she lived out the remainder of her life alone. We do know, however, that her sons stayed with their father and were raised by him until his death in 12 AD. At that point, both boys moved in with their grandfather, Augustus. who was more than happy to have them around. You see, since becoming emperor, Augustus had basically turned the position into a constitutional monarchy. All of the major positions of power within the state were held by himself or people he could control, like Agrippa. This gave the Senate back its powers and allowed it to function much like it did under the old republic, with Augustus as a figurehead at the top, except he also had absolute power to appoint people to those positions. In effect, Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, and he wanted to make sure that his successors would also be puppets that he could control, which is why he decided to groom his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, for the role. In fact, Augustus showered them with the kind of love and attention that every young child wants from their grandfather. He gave them the finest tutors and made sure they were involved in every important public ceremony. Gaius was given command of the legions stationed in and around Rome at the age of 19, even though he had no real authority over them. This was done to familiarize him with the mechanics of the military, so that he would be prepared to take over as its leader one day. And Augustus paraded him around the countryside in chariots, like a mini Caesar. As historian Suetonius tells us, he delighted in having them ride with him in his curricle, while driving at speed along the Appian Way. On these occasions, he used to put little veils over the faces of the boys, and then he would drive recklessly through the streets of Rome, frightening them with sudden stops and turns. As you can imagine, this sort of upbringing gave Gaius a sense of entitlement, and he quickly developed a reputation as being spoiled and arrogant, even though he was by all accounts quite intelligent, and ambitious too. The younger of the two, Lucius, was actually a little bit different. Where Gaius was loud and boisterous, Lucius was quiet and serious. This was probably because Lucius was the one who truly believed he would one day become emperor, while Gaius thought it would be cool to be emperor, but he didn't really want the responsibility. Regardless, Augustus wanted both of his grandsons to become emperor. Why, you ask? Well, he had a lot of respect for the boy's grandfather, and that was none other than Marcus Antonius, aka Mark Antony the Great Triumvirate, and Julius Caesar's right-hand man, who eventually lost everything including his life, thanks to Augustus. Now, despite the outcome, Augustus knew that Antony had been the most capable Roman politician of his generation. If he hadn't betrayed him, they might have ruled the empire together. And since Augustus had come to believe that he couldn't trust anyone else either, he figured that by marrying his bloodline to Antony's, he would have someone who was more than capable of ruling Rome in his place, even if he was also a bit of a liability. And to make sure there would be no doubt about who would follow him, Augustus declared both Gaius and Lucius his heirs apparent. Then he did something nobody had seen coming. He married his daughter Julia off to a member of the Claudian family, a distant relative of Antonius, who served as a military tribune in Antony's army during the Civil War and had fought valiantly against Augustus. But now he was a changed man and was eager to please his new grandfather. And Augustus, eager to grow his web of familial connections, gladly accepted the union, cementing the relationship between the Julio-Claudians and the Claudians. But unfortunately for all involved, this marriage would produce no children, so Gaius and Lucius were still in line to be emperor after Augustus. That is, until one cold winter's night in 02 AD, when both boys came down with a fever. But the fever only lasted a couple of days for Gaius. By contrast, Lucius never got over it, and after suffering for nearly 6 months, he finally died. There's very little known about the nature of the disease that afflicted the boy, though some historians think it may have been typhoid fever, which is spread by contaminated water and food. Either way, Gaius recovered fully and was overjoyed that he was now the sole heir to his grandfather's throne. Finally, he was going to be emperor. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Just 7 months later, Gaius came down with the same fever that killed his brother and died just as suddenly. And so, at the ripe age of 25, both of Augustus's grandsons and heirs apparent were dead. Whoops, now. Obviously, this was a problem for Augustus, because he needed someone to pass the torch to when he was done. But he also didn't want to waste time finding someone new. He was already 63 years old, and he wanted to enjoy his remaining years in relative peace, not deal with the problems of succession. Luckily for him, there was someone else in his family who wasn't married, his son, Tiberius Claudius Nero, the last surviving member of the Julian-Claudian line. The thing was, Tiberius wasn't exactly close to his father. Augustus had sent him away from Rome at a young age to live with his grandmother on the island of Rhodes, and when he was 18, he married a woman named Vipsania, who was a lot older than him and bore him two children, both of whom also died in childhood. After that, Tiberius gave up on the whole marriage thing, and although his father had tried to marry him off a few times, he refused to cooperate, knowing full well that his uncle had made it clear that only a virgin could ascend to the throne. But regardless of his attitude towards women, it was clear that he was the next in line now that Gaius and Lucius were dead. Augustus needed someone to pass the torch to when he was gone, and despite his shortcomings, Tiberius was still his closest living relative. So he called him back to Rome and began grooming him for the role. Unfortunately for Tiberius, it was too little, too late. Even though he was always obedient to his father, and by extension Augustus, he knew that he would never have been considered emperor if his cousins had lived, and so he resented them and the opportunities they were given. But perhaps deep down he knew that it was his destiny to rule anyway. Want to know how Tiberius took to his new role as heir apparent? Well, you'll have to tune in next time to find out. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was this series. If you love this content and you want to support the channel directly, consider joining my membership program. As a member, you get access to exclusive content, including early access to every video. New episodes are released every Friday and Saturday, and you can watch them as soon as they drop without ads. Plus, you'll get to vote on the next books we read and review on this channel. Join today and help us make history together. Augustus had been suffering for several years with a mysterious illness that made him impotent, which is actually the correct word here, by the way. It means unable to produce offspring, and this was an acute problem for Augustus, because he desperately wanted a son to secure the succession after him. But no children came, and so Augustus got increasingly irritated with his balls, if you will, or rather without them. He did manage to adopt a stepson through his sister Octavia, a boy called Tiberius, and he did welcome him into the family in 04 AD and groomed him to take over the imperial role. But having failed to produce any biological heirs, Augustus became fixated on the idea of being remembered for his divine right to rule and the legitimacy of his Julio-Claudian dynasty. He wanted to be seen as a god in human form, and yet there was no divine mandate that he could point to. No golden child born under a special sign, no validation from the gods that he could wield in the face of his enemies. In his last years, then, he tried to shape his own legacy. In 14 CE, when he died, Rome mourned the loss of the first emperor. They mourned the man who'd restored order and prosperity to the Republic after decades of civil war. People wept as his litter was carried through the streets to the Forum, where a funeral pyre had been erected. His body was laid out on a golden bier draped in purple, and it was surrounded by lit candelabers and statues of his ancestors from the Geschlecht, the first emperor. 3 days later, when his funeral procession arrived at the Campus Martius, Augustus' spirit was said to have left his mortal coil and to have joined the ranks of the gods. In the centuries to come, emperors would compete with one another to be the best Augusto, to follow in the footsteps of the great original. So even though he ruled for 40 years, Augustus always saw himself as a servant of the Republic, even though he'd effectively ended it. The idea of a hereditary monarchy was so radical that it needed a cover story, and so he chose the fiction of being a republican returning to the ways of the past. The funeral games that were held in his honor are believed to have inspired Ovid's celebrated poem on the subject, which depicts a radiant Augustus entering the gates of heaven. A banner displayed the words Jivus Augustus, meaning deified Augustus. This title would become part of his name, and it was used on coins minted throughout the empire. But in spite of the crowds of adoring citizens, Livia, his wife, and perhaps his closest advisor during those early years, was blamed for the fact that he'd left no biological heir. She was accused of murdering children, both her own and the children of other women, and she was apparently suspected of killing Augustus himself, although it was more likely that he died from cancer. Ovid wrote that it was a deep sorrow to the Roman people to lose their king. This title caught on, and it was used even on official inscriptions. So it seems likely that the propaganda campaign that Augustus had started while he was alive continued under the next emperor, Tiberius, to turn Augustus into a god in all but name. After all, what does divus mean? It means divine. The people were mourning the loss of their king, yes, but they were also mourning the loss of their god. Or at least, they were encouraged to do so. To the end, Augustus never formally assumed the title of king, nor did he allow any image of himself to be displayed in public with a crown. There's only one known portrait of Augustus wearing a crown, and it was made at least 2 centuries after he died. But let's get back to Ovid's poem, because in it, Augustus is depicted as a soldier once more, marching into battle, albeit against the giants. There's no mention of his deeds as an administrator or a legislator, but he is praised for subduing peoples and adding lands to the Roman sphere of influence. These lines represent the view of the Julio-Claudian emperors of themselves as new Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, restoring good order to a troubled world. And yet, despite all of his efforts to mold his own image and to fashion his legacy, it was not the Julio-Claudians who founded the dynasty that gave Rome its golden age and set it on the path to becoming a major world power. It was Augustus, and we can see this quite clearly in the last lines of the poem, where Ovid writes that it was thanks to Augustus that the Roman people enjoyed a long period of peace. Pax Augusta. That's how we know what this period is called, because the poet tells us so. We don't know if Augustus himself coined the term, but it's a very catchy slogan, and he used it alongside the phrase Augustus, his personal name, which also evolved into a term for the whole period itself. The name Augustus means majestic, venerable, impressive. When he took the title, he was 63 years old, and if you think about it, the name suited him. His face was actually quite handsome, but it was weathered and lined with age, and so he tended to favor portraits that showed him as a mature and stately figure. Only one official statue survives, and it shows a middle-aged Augustus dressed in the robes of a high priest. He was a majestic figure though, and a venerable one too, because he ushered in a golden age of peace and prosperity, of art and architecture. That's why many historians call the period between 27 BC and 14 CE the Augustan Age. He looked back to the values of the past, and he drew inspiration from the art and literature of Greece and Greece. Rome, however, was never just a copy of Greece. The Greeks regarded poetry as the highest form of literature, but in Rome, the spoken word was more important. Greek poets like Homer were read aloud in Roman households, but they were performed by slaves. Romans liked their spectacles. They liked watching wild animals fight each other in the arena, criminals fight to the death, condemned men fight gladiators, and these events were often followed by executions. Rome was the place to go if you wanted to see a show. And so the Romans, they commissioned poets like Horace and Virgil to write poetry that celebrated the stability and prosperity of the Augustan age, the Pax Augusta. Of course, if you want to build a golden age, you need gold, you need money. And where does that come from? From taxes, of course. Augustus introduced a property tax and an inheritance tax, and he imposed taxes on trade and on industry. One of his most famous building projects was the Forum of Augustus, a square built on the ruins of the burnt-down Republican Forum. It was here, beneath his statue, the only official statue, by the way, that senators met before making their way into the Senate House, which was also built by Augustus. He built temples to the gods, including one to himself as the personification of the Roman state, and he erected altars across the empire for people to sacrifice to the genius of Augustus. He wasn't much of a builder really, because he preferred modest and understated buildings, but he left a lasting impact on the city nonetheless. He established a fire brigade and a police force, and he appointed magistrates to oversee public works and to maintain order. Rome, he said, was his inheritance from his predecessors, and it was his duty to leave it to his successors in better condition than he found it. In fact, his program of building and restoring and repairing was largely a propaganda tool that emphasized the peace and stability of his age. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider becoming a patron. Visit the support page or click the join button. Thanks for watching. Bye.